Welcome to session 6 of the 20th Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. Today's date is September 2nd, 2021. This session is titled ILL plus COVID-19 equals Eventual Returnables plus Non-Returnables equals oh my gosh, and will be presented by Michelle Lenox, Justyne Triest, and Jerica Tullo from the Pacific University Libraries. My name is Sofiya Dahman, and I'm the convener for this session. This session is being recorded with permission from the presenters. They retain the copyright to the information they're presenting and may request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to the NWILL committee chairperson. However, at this time, it is planned that the recordings will be available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn live captioning on, click the closed captions link at the bottom of the screen and select show subtitle. If you have a question during the session, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And I will pose these to the presenters at the end of the presentation. The door prize keyword will be reviewed between the presentation and the Q&A. Please see the door prize link in the event MOBI menu. When the Zoom webinar ends, please complete the post-session survey in event MOBI located at the bottom of the session page. On that note, I will turn the session over to our presenters.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. This is ILL plus COVID-19 equals ERs plus NRs equals OMG, and soon you will know what that means. We are from Pacific University Libraries in Forest Grove, Oregon. My name is Jerica Tullo. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Interlibrary Services Manager in the Access Services Department.
Hi, my name is Justyne Triest. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Interlibrary Services Supervisor in the Access Services Department.
And my name is Michelle Lenox. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Acquisitions and Cataloging Manager in the Collection Services Department.
So we'd like to get started with a land acknowledgement, which I'm going to read through here. We respectfully acknowledge that we're speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Atwal, also known as the Tualatin Kalapuyas, who lived around what is now Forest Grove and Hillsborough. We encourage you to learn about the people who both traditionally lived on this land and still do so if you have not already explored that for yourself. Please take a moment to reflect on the land that you are on. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this region, whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to the land and water, and whose lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants today. All right, so now we have some specific information about Pacific University Libraries for you. So we serve around 3,850 students, and that's pretty evenly split between graduate and undergraduate students. The libraries have 4 campus locations: Forest Grove, Hillsborough, Eugene, and Woodburn, all in Oregon. Hillsborough and Forest Grove are staffed locations, and like Jerica said, we're speaking to you from our Tran Library in Forest Grove campus today, and that's what's pictured here on the slide. It's very pretty year-round, but especially in the spring with those cherry blossoms. So we have about 23 library staff and about 70 to 90 awesome student workers who we could not run the library without. And you can see our collection stats here, but overall we have around 443,000 total resources. All right, so we also wanted to share some information about interlibrary loan and our department there as well. So COVID caveats is a hard thing to say, practice that one a lot on our numbers here. They might be a little bit skewed because of COVID, and they are raw numbers. They do include our cancellations, but this will give you a rough idea of how many requests we work with at Pacific. So for borrowing and document delivery combined, we are around 4,100, 4,700 requests a year for our last couple of fiscal years, and lending is between 9,000 and 14,000. We are going to talk a lot more about distance learners in our presentation, but for a rough idea, we generally send around 55 packages to our distance learners in a year, and a portion of those are prepaid returns, which again, we'll also talk more about too. All distance learner shipping is always free both ways. So we do all of this with staff of 2 full-time ILL folks, that's Jerica and I, at Tran Library in Forest Grove, and we handle all aspects of ILL, borrowing, DocDel, lending. And then we do that as well with 3 to 5 awesome student workers. And so over in Hillsborough, we have a couple of colleagues who are in our access services department that we are also in, and they have about 15 awesome student workers who help them out as well. They primarily work with lending and some document delivery, a lot of electronic lending article requests. So if you've gotten some of those from us, it's probably been filled by a Hillsborough student worker. And Michelle's going to talk to you a little bit more about collection services.
Yes, thank you, Justyne. So the collection services team at the library is made up of 5 staff members, including the collections librarian, who is the department head, a two-person acquisitions and cataloging team, one of whom is me, a 2-person electronic resources team, and our amazing student workers. We have a centralized collections model at Pacific. So this department does collection development and management, acquisitions, cataloging and metadata work, electronic resources management, and data collection for various reporting and analysis needs. A few quick facts to give you a sense of our scale. As Justyne mentioned, we have a total collection size of around 443,000 resources in all formats. In fiscal year 2021, we added 1,219 physical books and media to the collection. And as a comparison to our last relatively normal year, in FY 18-19, we added 1,137, so roughly the same actually. Collection Services runs the library's patron-driven request a purchase program, which we'll be discussing more later. And for that program, we fielded over 700 requests for resources across all formats between March 2020 and March 2021. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we wanted to give you kind of a broad overview of Pacific University libraries adapting rapidly to the pandemic. We're going to definitely talk about that more in detail, but like many of you may have done, we went remote in March 2020. We never fully stopped working, but we did physically close the buildings until August 2020 when the undergrads resumed their fall term on campus. And we had ILL and CS staff, including student workers, back in the building part-time from August 2020 until about April 2021, when some staff started to return to full-time, including some of our student workers too. So we used a variety of methods to communicate changes in services to our patrons, including campus-wide emails, website alerts, Iliad web alerts, and notes in our Iliad request forms, which you can see pictured down here at the bottom. Okay, and so you all have been waiting very patiently with us for the last several minutes. We're going to give you an explanation on some of our jargon that we were teasing you with in our title. So we built on a free returns for distance learner pilot that we've been running for a couple of years that we're going to talk more about as well, to include purchasing eventually returnables, ERs, purchasing non-returnables, NRs, and having patrons return books to us via FedEx prepaid returns. Okay, and so now before we jump into talking about how the pandemic changed some of our practices, here's a few quick definitions of the programs that we're going to be talking about in detail. So the first one here is the Request a Purchase program, which is a program that collection services had that predated the pandemic, where we buy resources on patron request. Then we have Eventually Returnables, which is a new collection services program prompted by COVID quarantine and closures to ship requested items directly from the vendor to the requesting patron. Then the patron returns the items later in person or by mail. Non-Returnables is an ILL program that predates the pandemic as well, where we buy inexpensive resources on patron request, we ship them directly to the patron, and then the patron keeps the item. And as I'm sure you can imagine, these processes require close collaboration between CS and ILL. And then over to Michelle to talk to you more about that.
Thank you. So one of the major changes prompted by the pandemic was the expansion of Collection Services Request a Purchase program. This program had been running successfully and evolving for over 5 years before the pandemic. It started out as a way for non-faculty users to ask the library to acquire resources, with faculty mostly going through their library liaison for requests, although they could also use this service. But Pacific transitioned from a liaison model to a centralized model of collection development about 2 years ago. And with that, request to purchase expanded and refocused. It became the primary way for faculty to request the acquisition of library resources. Students and staff also continued to use it to request purchases. Requests could be made for research needs or for recreation, for course-related reading, or just because the library should own the item. Faculty could also place requests for required course materials to be put on course reserve. However, there were restrictions, especially on non-faculty requests, which were limited to items that cost less than $50 and were in a physical format. Students could not request required course materials, and unless the patron was a distance learner or a distance faculty, they would have to pick up the resource on campus. At that time, our relationship in CS with ILL was that if something came into ILL that could not be filled by another library, they would refer it to collection services to see if it could become a purchase request. Meanwhile, if something came in to request a purchase that was impossible to acquire or was too expensive, we would refer it to ILL to see if it could become a borrowing request. However, starting in March 2020, we tore down our existing request a purchase program and rebuilt it in a new expanded form, figuring out new processes and parameters as we went. In the early months of the pandemic, the library buildings were closed to patrons. So online resources were prioritized and request a purchase was temporarily rebranded Request a Digital Resource. Anyone could request a digital resource and there were no price limits. We evaluated requests on a case-by-case basis, but especially early on, we would at times spend up to $1,000 or more on electronic access for an important course resource to help students and faculty finish out their year successfully. We considered non-traditional vendors, especially for streaming content, and even self-hosted several videos. We accepted requests for textbooks and other course materials from students or faculty. We would buy electronic access if possible and print for scanning if not. We also introduced the option for all users of having physical requests shipped directly to their homes to be returned later and added to the collection, since holds could not be picked up on campus and no staff was in the library to process new books. This was branded the Eventual Returnables program. We continued to pass requests back and forth between collection services and ILL, as their COVID services, such as scanning, article requests, and especially non-returnables, were complementary to our own services. Through these workflows, we were able to help students and instructors continue learning and teaching in challenging circumstances. Next slide, please. So how did the expanded COVID era request a purchase program work when a request came in? It would start with a request received in one of multiple ways. Many came from ILL if they received a request that couldn't be filled through their services or would best be approached as a purchase request, like for a required course text. We also continued to receive requests through our request to purchase web form. Circulation staff and other library staff also received email, phone, and chat requests for resources, and they referred them on to us. And some patrons who we had worked with before emailed us directly. After receiving a request, the first question was whether it was required for a class. If it was not required for a class, we would research options and formats, and depending on what was available and what the patron preferred, we would order the ebook or streaming video or buy a physical copy and have it shipped to the patron directly or shipped to the library for pickup if we were open for holds pickup at the time. If there were no workable purchase options, we would refer to ILL if possible and otherwise not fill the request. Now, if the request was for a resource required for a class and the requester was a faculty member, we would research the format and options and buy unlimited user ebook or streaming video access if possible, or up to around $600 worth of user seats if it was only available as a limited user resource. If there was no electronic option, we would offer print for the faculty's own use or for scanning if we were in a stage of our pandemic workflows where we were offering extensive scanning under emergency provisions. If the requester for a course resource was a student, we would research the options, and then if there was an electronic option, we would email the instructor to let them know what our options were. As with faculty originating requests, we would buy unlimited user access or up to $600 of limited access. If the faculty member did not get back to us quickly, we would move forward with the purchase and let the student and instructor know to access the resource, how to access the resource when it became available. For students, if there was no electronic option, they might in some cases be able to request the item through interlibrary loan. And if the instructor asked for a physical copy for themselves or for scanning, we would provide that if possible. Next slide, please. So now that we have made it through the pandemic request to purchase algorithm, we'll take a brief moment to consider the chart that you did not have to try to read. Next slide, please. Once you start creating boxes and diamonds, diagrams, it's really hard to stop. Luckily, we managed to streamline it a little bit. Next slide, please. So how did the expanded program work out in practice? We fielded over 700 purchase requests between March 2020 and March 2021. We were able to get the patron what they needed in some format about 80% of the time. In 129 of these requests were filled as physical books that we shipped directly to the patron as part of the Eventually Returnables program. Interestingly, we have not received any Eventually Returnable shipping requests from our users since February. Users really transitioned back to picking up requests at the circ desk once the library was open again and they were back on campus a bit more, though there were still some non-returnables filled after that point. We accepted at the time that we began the ER program that not everything we shipped to patrons would be returned. And we decided from the outset that we would not be aggressive about getting these materials back or charge patrons for not returning them. It was a stressful, chaotic time for so many of our users, and we didn't want to add more stress to people's lives. The ILL department sent patrons with ERs 2 email notices a few months apart about returns and prepaid mailing labels. As of July, 53 ERs have been returned and 76 had not been returned. And I'll just add here that we have received a few more coming back just recently. So this is a 59% loss rate. However, many of the requests were from faculty who had a year-long loan period on normal checkouts and often would keep them for longer. These borrowers may intend to keep the books for an extended time, but will ultimately return these items once they are done using them. And even if we don't get any of the remaining 76 books back, we still feel that the benefits of the program, allowing for teaching, learning, and scholarship to continue under difficult circumstances, was well worth the investment. Next slide, please. A common question that we get about the expanded request to purchase and eventually returnables program is how these services were funded. We did not receive any extra funds, but we did reallocate and prioritize some of our existing operational funds for this purpose. During the pandemic, we paused most traditional print collection development due to budget uncertainty and lack of staffing to receive new print materials in the library. So instead, we expanded our patron-driven acquisition. We also received support from library administration for these projects and for reserving funds for this purpose. And so far, the expanded services have been financially sustainable even for post-pandemic times. Additionally, these service expansions align with the library's core value of equitable access to information. Our goal is to be able to continue providing these expanded and flexible request to purchase services into the future. Next slide, please.
So as Michelle has been mentioning, this process has been a close collaboration between CS and ILL. However, we could not have done this without a close collaboration with another department, our mail services, which have been amazing. They've been so helpful. So in addition to the normal ILL and distance learner packages that mail services sends for ILL on a daily basis, mail services said, no problem, when we approached them asking if we could send prepaid FedEx return ground labels via email to patrons who had books at their homes and were not coming back to campus anytime soon. This made it so we can not only get back ILL items, but local items and consortia borrowed items as well, in addition to those eventually returnables. ILL coordinated with mail services and handled all returns for any type of library material for any patrons who were unable to come to a campus location. This was especially helpful as our campus physical shutdown persisted through graduation in May 2020, so that it enabled us to get materials back from graduating seniors. So we didn't have a ton of these. We had about 10 of these requests in the fiscal year of 2020, 2021, but each one required a number of emails between us and mail services, us and patrons, patrons and mail services, et cetera. So they're pretty time consuming to deal with. We currently have a handful more in process that we're waiting for the patron to reach back out to us on, those eventually returnables Michelle was mentioning, but we're tracking those in a spreadsheet that our remote student workers for ILL actually assisted with by getting the catalog records that CS had put in the catalog to see if the item had been returned. So they're able to go in and check that. Additionally, another one of the projects we were able to provide for our remote student workers in ILL was sending template emails from our shared ILL email to patrons to set up the prepaid return process. So another benefit of this is we were able to come up with some remote projects for our ILL students during a time when they were not working in person.
All right. So in July of 2019, Interlibrary Loan began our free non-returnable program for distance learners. Many of our distance learners were enrolled in our MFA program and required very cheap books for entire semesters. Borrowing these items and shipping them back and forth ended up costing us more than the book itself, so we decided to start purchasing books under $15 and sending them to patrons to keep. The service was available to students, faculty, and staff who are located on our Woodburn or Eugene campuses or were taking remote classes. When we moved to remote services in March 2020, we bumped up the price point to $50 and decided to include all of our patrons in the distance learner definition. Instead of receiving these items ourselves and then mailing them on, we began to purchase these books and send them directly to patrons' homes. During our communications with the patrons, we would make sure that they understood that these books were theirs to keep and there was no obligation to return them. Next slide, please. So as expected, running the program showed us the gaps in our policies, so we rolled with the punches and continued to create new criteria, while also allowing ourselves to break our own rules when necessary. Our first change was that our $50 per item became $50 per patron, which reset at the beginning of each fiscal year. Our budget drove this decision as we began to see some extremely high use patrons with many requests for items around that $50 mark. This change didn't remove them from enjoying the program though. Instead, after a patron hit that mark, we would transition the request over to eventually returnables. Second, when we received multiple requests for the same item, we worked with collection services to see what electronic options were available that could allow for multiple people to access the work. Electronic options were always discussed with the patrons before purchasing, unless they'd explicitly asked for that format, and we would purchase multiple in-our copies if need be. Third, the requested item couldn't be freely available on the internet. Fourth, the requested item couldn't be a course text. Our libraries provide many course texts as reserves, and collection services and circulation were hard at work providing digital copies of those needed texts. We would pass along these requests to find unlimited user ebooks and work with patrons to fill chapter requests as we search for better solutions. I will also note that we do request textbooks through ILO for students during normal times, but these requests were not eligible for in-our purchasing. Lastly, we never required that their request be for clearly academic research. Before the pandemic, we never asked what a patron would be using that item for, so we didn't really want to start now. Next slide, please. So in the early days of the pandemic, many vendors shut down and mailing was incredibly slow, so we took a lot of our business to Amazon. We recognized that we were contributing to a company and power structure that was inequitable and was known for having poor working conditions. We wanted to move our money towards businesses that aligned more with our ideals. One goal of our current EDI plan is to develop criteria and a framework for evaluating and selecting external vendors using equity and anti-racism rubrics. While this work is still ongoing, we made the decision to use Amazon as little as possible, as soon as possible. This decision is not library-wide currently, but is a staple of our in-our program. While we waited for other ethical options to find their footing, we turned to bookshop.org, which donates portions of their proceeds to local bookstores and Barnes & Noble. Soon we were able to expand our search to include local bookstores and smaller publishing companies, some of which you can see on the screen. We would check titles against as many options as possible, though our most successful finds were usually through bookshop.org, Powell's, and Barnes & Noble. If our patron was in a hurry for their item, we would still default to Amazon, but they were our last resort option, and we would try to use their marketplace more than their other services. Though Amazon would often have the best prices, we would make the choice to spend a little bit more money at another place if the option was there. Next slide, please. However, sometimes you do have to use Amazon, such as when a patron wants an ebook. When you have an Amazon business account, they now give you the option to purchase Kindle ebooks for other people at the same price. When you purchase an ebook using the Buy for Others option, you're given a download link as well as status updates about whether or not the item's been redeemed. Your download link can be passed along to your patron without needing any of their account information, but they must have an Amazon account to redeem. Amazon often had ebooks available that we weren't able to purchase for the library, so this helped us close a big gap for many of our patrons. If we were able to find ebook options that didn't involve Amazon, included a downloadable PDF that we could forward on, we would do that instead. Next slide, please. So we did assume that our in-our workflow would be fairly straightforward. We expected these requests to come through Iliad as normal. We would check to see if the item matched our criteria, research purchasing options, email the patron, and then simply purchase the item. And this was how many requests came to us, but definitely not all of them. Sometimes these requests came to us by email through collection services via their request to purchase program, by email through circulation, or by direct email to ILO. Once the requests reach us, though, the steps after were all the same. Our shared purchasing spreadsheet between ILO and CS made a huge difference, as we were able to search what other department had purchased to make sure that there was no overlap. Another key piece to our workflow was what happened when we received Iliad requests for items that didn't meet our criteria. I've mentioned how we've handled like freely available items and course texts, but what about items that were already over $50? These requests would be sent to collection services to be included in their ER program. They would research their options and provide that information to us, and we would act as the go-between for them and the patron. This did involve some passing information back and forth, but it provided a much more seamless experience for our patrons, and that was definitely the most important thing. Next slide, please. All right, so during our original in-our program, we purchased 13 items for a total of $187.84. Since March 2020, we've purchased 216 items for a total of $5,124.66 across 3 fiscal years. It's important to note that we also did not receive extra funding for this program. Instead, we combined our funds for the original in-our program and our funds for article purchasing through June 2021. With the caveat that we just let our dean know when we hit certain dollar thresholds. We are now currently funding this program solely through original in-our program funds. And best of all, this program has remained entirely free for our patrons the entire time. All right, and back over to Michelle.
Thank you. So we created new processes on the fly under unique pressures and urgency to get resources to users as quickly as possible after the abrupt closure of campuses and pivot to online learning. Once we had started to smooth out our workflows and had fielded a number of requests, we had a chance to consider some of the questions that arose out of these reinvented services. Some of the questions we found ourselves needing to answer included: do we start buying print textbooks for individual student use? Answer, no. Do we buy e-textbooks and streaming videos on student request? Answer, yes. What happens when a required text is only available to buy as a one-user ebook? Answer, buy up to around $600 worth of access, which usually gave us between 3 to 10 simultaneous users. What happens when a faculty member requests a streaming video that is only available as a self-hosted MP4 file or other non-ideal access option like a password-protected Vimeo video? Answer, in general, if we could honor the terms of use and get the content to the instructor and students, we would license the video. What happens when a single patron requests many inexpensive non-returnables that collectively far exceed the non-returnable price cap? Answer, transfer them to collection services for eventually returnable service. What happens when a single patron requests a very large number of eventually returnables? Answer, we approach this on a case-by-case basis. For faculty who just wanted items to be added to the collection, we would ask them if the orders could wait until the library reopened. For inexpensive requests, especially of duplicated or recreational content, we would transfer them to ILL for non-returnable requests. For resources that would be used immediately for scholarship, teaching, or learning, we considered this to be in alignment with the objectives of the program and filled the requests, even if there were a lot of them. Next slide, please. Once we had answers to these and similar questions that we wanted to formalize, we drafted guidelines and policies for internal and/or patron use. An example is the collection services guidelines regarding limited user ebooks for course resources, which were shared with library staff so there was clarity and consistency about what we could and could not offer to patrons. Next slide, please. Another example is the non-returnable purchasing guidelines on the ILL webpage, which states, at times we may request that books that are individually under $50 be returned to the library in cases where they would be valuable to the library collection and/or the total of requests submitted at any one time exceeds $50. The request to purchase webpage has similar types of public-facing information about policies and what patrons might expect from this service. Next slide, please. The goal of our written guidelines and rules around COVID-era ILL and collection services options were consistency in decision-making and user experience, clarity that reduced uncertainty about what to do in a given case, efficiency because we didn't have to spend as much time discussing particular requests, and the ability to communicate well with users and staff by providing context from the outset and documentation to case of questions. However, we still prioritized being flexible and focused on supporting users and would consider the context of requests and adapt and adjust as needed. Next slide, please.
So like Michelle mentioned, communication is key to making these projects work. At the beginning of the pandemic, our patrons were getting flooded with emails from the university and dealing with their own feelings about what was going on, all while we attempted to roll out new programs. Here's what we found to be the most helpful when communicating with patrons. First, give clear expectations about mailing timeframes. This was most important in the beginning and around holidays. Second, give clear expectations about what's required of them. Would they need to return their item, let us know when it arrived, download a book, whatever it was, we were upfront about what their role was. Third, verify what item and format was needed. This not only kept us from making mistakes, it gave the patron a chance to change their mind and to feel in control of their request. Fourth, explain that multiple items can mean multiple packages. This stopped us from being flooded with, I only received one book emails, and set our patrons up for success. Fifth, offer assurance that this program is for them when they're hesitant. Many patrons felt uncomfortable at the thought of us using our money to benefit them in this way, so we let them know that they were exactly who the program was for and encouraged them to use it as they needed. Sixth, explain everything in simplest terms. It's so easy to fall into library lingo or think someone else will understand what we mean no matter what. We worked constantly to break down our emails into simplest terms possible so there was as little confusion as possible. And our last point is not necessarily related to patron emails, but it's still the most important to us. Collaborate with your other departments. These programs could not have been successful without close and constant collaboration between CS and ILL, and better work partnerships have come from that. So if you're not already doing this, I highly encourage it. Back over to you, Justyne.
Great. So we've been really happy with these programs, and we're also very grateful for the flexibility we had to create and offer them. But the most important thing is, what do our users think? We're happy to report that we've received many thank you emails, and even more important, many repeat users, including ones that hadn't used the services prior. And here's just a few patron comments about the non-returnables specifically. All right, so to wrap up, we wanted to touch on where we are now and where we see ourselves headed with these services. So traditional ILL loans partially resumed in August 2020 when the buildings reopened and are basically fully operational as of spring 2021 onward. Eventually, returnables are available as needed, but as Michelle mentioned, no requests have met the criteria after February 2021 due to traditional ILL and other methods resuming. Non-returnables continue to be used as needed for all patrons for things like rare items, new and popular items that we need additional copies of, and specialty items that wouldn't be a good fit for the collection. Request to purchase continues to be used as needed for all patrons in the expanded form. And we continue to send all items with free shipping and free returns to anyone who can't come to campus. So before we move on to the Q&A, as promised, here's the door prize challenge slide.
Thank you so much for this detailed presentation. The clue for the door prize is this park's waterfalls is in 2 countries, the US and Canada, and the park is Niagara Falls State Park, and I will put that in the chat as well. We do have some questions. First one, did you have any problems getting print book requests filled? We had to temporarily stop people submitting requests for books because a majority of them could not be filled as so many libraries were closed or staff could not access the print collections.
I will take part of that at least. For books that we purchased for other people, we didn't have too many problems filling them. We had a problem early on of getting them to people quickly. But luckily, once things started opening up, we were able to just buy and send, and they would just get it in the time that they got it. Maybe Michelle has more to say about the rest of it though. Not to put you on the spot.
No, like we had trouble sometimes with getting like the purchase request filled quickly if we were in a phase of the pandemic disruptions to various logistical parts of shipping, etc. There were a couple of like international shipments that ended up getting stuck in customs forever because borders had been closed. So we definitely had some disruptions like that, but in general, and patrons, we told them, what the ETA was if we knew it, and we also let them know if there was a revised ETA. So really upfront as much as we could be about what they could expect as far as arrivals. Does that answer the question?
The next question. There is only one request form for patrons. Staff make all the workflow decisions about which track to pursue. Do staff contact patron for each possible track? Couldn't purchase ebook. Do you want to purchase print? If you couldn't purchase an ebook, do you want to purchase print?
I can also start answering that question. We had multiple request forms, and it just kind of depended on how people found us and how they wanted to get their requests in, and that we would just send them back and forth between the 3 of us, usually just through email. We made decisions on what to do with each request. It was pretty much up to us. We were given permission to just kind of do what we needed to do as we needed to do it. So it changed as we went, but we could just make those decisions, and we tried to get everything that we could. We did, at least for us, I don't want to speak for you, Michelle, but we contacted everybody that requested something and let them know, like, this is what's happening. This is what you can expect. Like, we tried to let everybody know, even if we couldn't get it for them, and let them know, like, here's all of your options. What would you prefer? What do you want? Things like that.
And a lot of our requests came in through Iliad, and then we sort of triaged them from there. So people were putting in interlibrary loan requests as the way they normally would have. So that might answer the part about the one form. It was primarily Iliad. Yeah,
and then on the collection services side, we still had the request a purchase form up, although we did change it. We changed its name for a kind of a brief period of time to request a digital resource so that people really knew that mostly what we could offer at that time was ebook purchasing if there was in fact an ebook that we could purchase. So we also fielded a lot of requests through our request to purchase form. And then, like Jerica and Justyne said, we would refer requests back and forth between the two departments as appropriate. And then, yes, we also contacted all of the patrons who submitted requests. And we, especially early on, were really focused on digital access, but if we could potentially make that into an eventually returnable or a non-returnable before we went to a non-preferred format, we would check in with the patron to see if that would work for them.
The next question, I'm a tiny bit confused. When you talked about not wanting to add more stress to patrons to get books back, were these books you borrowed from another library that you just paid to cover the replacement cost for the lending library, or were they your library owned books?
So those were the books that we had ordered for the Eventually Returnables program. So we had bought them, intending them to be for the library eventually, but because the library was closed and we didn't have staff to do receiving, cataloging, processing, we were having them shipped directly to the patron's home from our vendor, and then asking the patron to bring it back to the library or mail it back to the library with a prepaid return label after they were finished using it. So it was those books, they were purchased by the library. So they weren't from another library, they were our books that we were not being aggressive about pursuing for return.
Next question. Thank you. We are not able to freely purchase items, so I was just curious as to how you handle that traditional ILL print requests.
For a while, when we were physically closed, we weren't able to be doing the traditional print ILL because we didn't have any staff in the building to receive those. And so many other libraries were closed too. So that this is the transition that kind of helped bridge that gap until we were able to do more of that. And I think that's why we weren't seeing as many of those eventually returnable requests, really none after February 2021, since traditional ILL did resume at that time. That answers that question.
Next one. Did you provide used books in addition to brand new hard copies?
Yes, we did. I tried as often as possible when we were getting used copies to let people know, like, you're getting something used. It says it's in good condition, but just let us know. But we didn't necessarily go out of our way to try to get brand new copies, at least for the ones that weren't coming back to us. We made sure they were like in good condition and the sellers had good ratings, or it was like a store, but we did use used books, and we did that before the pandemic too. We would get whatever we could, and usually the cheaper ones are used, and Powell's has lots of used books anyways.
Well, we have a quick pause in the questions. I also just wanted to thank everyone for attending and say that if you have questions that come up afterwards via the email here, ill@pacificu.edu, and we will forward any collection services questions on to Michelle. So don't hesitate to email us questions too.
And I will also just add for the CS side of the question about used and new copies, we also would at times order used copies for the eventually returnables, although because our ideal end game was that the books would end up in our collections, we would default to new if there was an affordable new option.
There are a few more questions on chat. Hi-O SNHUHC7 has also routinely purchased books to fill requests for our distance students faculty for many years. In the fall before COVID, we started providing our distance students a prepaid FedEx return label. During COVID closures, I continued to come in to mail books to all patrons as well as to scan print materials. So there is another library that have utilized that service. I think that the next question was already answered. Did you provide used books? How did these services affect any grants for your library from federal and state grants?
It didn't. I don't have any more specifics to that. We are a private university. I don't know if that's helpful, but it didn't impact it or affect it in any way, as far as I know. We just used money that we already had. They just let us shift it around and use it how we needed.
Yes, we were just using our operational budget for our acquisitions around this.
And we've also, for years, purchased articles for patrons too, like in ILL when we've hit our copyright, numbers for the year, or we haven't been able to get them another way. So that was another way that we kind of expanded on the purchasing as well. Had a little bit of a basis there for that.
Thank you so much for answering the questions and for your presentation. Before we wrap up, just a quick reminder to everybody to complete the post-session survey at EventMobi. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for attending, and Northwest ILL for having us and getting this running for us. And again, email questions to ill@pacificu.edu if you have any. We would love to chat with you all more.
Thanks, everyone.
And I'll hang out here just for a moment to make sure that there aren't any technical questions hanging out in the chat. And I want to say thank you to all of you as well for joining us.
Our first Northwest ILL presentation after being at it for many years.
Yeah, I think this might be my 10th year of going.
There is one little extra question that hopped in there if you want to answer it. Where do you buy articles?
We buy them mostly from the publisher. We'll just go and get them from wherever it's available to be bought, but usually just directly from the publisher. We do also use Get It Now as another option.